accumulation can be kind of exciting. You see the account balances grow and hopefully compound and exponential on some level or time. But there's an emotional side of spending down your accounts that feels a little bit more technical and on some level emotionally heavy. And I think some people will even struggle with that spend down. Whereas the saving, especially for the box checkers, like the saving is kind of a dopamine hit there, right? On the accumulation of that. And a lot of pharmacists spend 30, maybe 40 plus years focused on the accumulation side of the retirement conversation, right? Saving, investing, maxing out accounts, hopefully watching those balances grow over time. But I think very few people stop along that way to ask, how is this money that we're accumulating? How is it actually going to turn into an income someday in retirement? And the question we talked about on last week's episode was, am I on track? And I think that question at some point naturally evolves to, okay, not only am I on track, but how do I actually use this money that I've been saving and investing, throughout my career? So I'm curious to hear your thoughts as we kick off this conversation. Why do you think there's not as much love, not as much attention on the decumulation side, which is our conversation today of retirement, as there is on the accumulation side?
It's a great question, Tim. Like, I don't know if I know the answer to that. I think the first thing that probably pops into my head is like, I think that there's like there's a focus just on like the destination of retirement. And I think it's, it's kind of a spaghetti against the wall, especially as you get 5 to 10 years out, like, spaghetti against the wall in terms of like, I'm just going to save as much as I can to just different buckets and hope for the best. So I do think it's this preoccupation with like, hey, I want to retire at 62 or 65 and I'm just, sticking my head down. But I think like once you get there, I think a lot of people are like, okay, what do I do? I think there's probably also this kind of belief that like, hey, with what I've saved and with Social Security, I think I'll be okay. Which could be true. Maybe not, and okay, is okay, like meeting my current lifestyle. I will say that, and I think I might have said this before, we believe very, very much so that like the CFP designation is a designation that if you are advising clients on, comprehensive financial planning, it's not a nice to have, it's a must have. But I think even with that designation, my belief is that it falls short in terms of the retirement income perspective. I think it's very much a designation that focuses on the accumulation phase and less so on like, okay, now the paycheck turns off and I'm in retirement. What do I do? Which is where the RICP Retirement Income Certified Professional comes in. So I look at the CFPs almost like, this is what's needed, kind of globally general, but more of an emphasis on accumulation. I think that RICP is, the other side of the phase of withdrawal or decumulation. So I think it's a psychological thing to answer your question for an investor or saver or retiree, pre-retiree. I think, but it's also like, I just think how professionals are trained is that it doesn't get as much of the hype. It's like, all right, you have $2 million and it's like, now what? And I think the now what question, it's almost like when we talk to students in our efforts with YFP Gives and, the education, and we talk about student loans, like that monopoly money doesn't become real until you start seeing those payments due, on the horizon. So I think it's a little bit of that.
Yeah, and just to define the alphabet soup, right? So RICP, Retirement Income Certified Professional. Did I get that right?
Yes.
RICP? Okay. Yeah, I agree with you. And not having gone through the CFP, obviously I didn't live it like you and other planners in our team have. But just looking at the curriculum, it's very much focused on the planning of the accumulation, side of things. And I do think there's an emotional piece here. You were alluding to that a bit, right? Accumulation can be kind of exciting. You see the account balances grow and hopefully compound and exponential on some level or time. We'll come back to this, but there's an emotional side of spending down your accounts that feels a little bit more technical and on some level emotionally heavy. And I think some people will even struggle with that spend down. Whereas the saving, especially for the box checkers, like the saving is it's kind of a dopamine hit there, right? On the accumulation of that. And for those that have been listening to our show for a while, we've talked about a more passive investing philosophy. And you've said on the show before that, hey, long-term investing for many people should be as boring as watching paint dry. And so on some level, at the risk of oversimplifying, accumulation, I don't want to say straightforward, but can be, if we have a more passive investing approach, can be a little bit more straightforward, right? We're trying to save consistently and do that, each and every month, each and every year over a long period of time. And we're trying to stay disciplined in that approach. However, the distribution side of it, I think there's a lot more complexity, that's involved. So Tim, I'm thinking about things like taxes and timing and various buckets and accounts, right? So the transition from the accumulation to the decumulation does add a layer of complexity. Again, I'm not suggesting the accumulation is simple, but it feels like there's more nuance and complexity on the decumulation side. Would you agree with that?
I think so. I think there's a lot more moving pieces, and I think now more than ever, you're kind of on an island, and what I mean by that is like, when a lot of baby boomers have had pensions, or even generations before that, right? And when the 401k came into vogue, like the pension became extinct. So the big reason that that's important is that it shifted the onus of risk and retirement planning from the employer to the employee. But then it's not just the accumulation phase. It's like now you have that pot of money and the employer's not, calculating a benefit. You have to figure that out. So that's, I think, the major backdrop and shift that's happened. And then because of that, like, we talk about, we've talked about the tax bomb. So just kind of jump to another idea here. Like we've talked about a tax bomb, again, related to forgiveness and student loan planning. But for a lot of retirees, you could see a tax bomb with regard to your retirement accounts because you might be 100%, 90% in a traditional 401k, a traditional 457, that type of thing. So you're being forced to take those RMDs at age 72, and that's forcing you to climb the tax bracket where you don't want to. So things like that are kind of ancillary things that you have to think about. So your point about you can kind of go on autopilot and just fill these buckets, that's true, but it could have consequences in retirement if you don't do that correctly in accumulation. So one of the strategies that we look at is tax location. Asset location is another word for that, to make sure that the buckets of money that we have are diverse in a sense of pre-tax, Roth, and taxable. So I think more than, Social Security, claiming, is nuanced. Healthcare, a lot of people believe that like, oh, Medicare will take care of you. That's not the case, or, that's not the case. Long-term care expenses, we're living longer. So now more than ever, all of these things kind of converge and we're left to kind of figure this out. And I would argue that we're just not trained to kind of be the CFO of our situation in an accumulation phase, but I think even more so in a decumulation phase, in a withdrawal phase. And that's I think what, we can wing it, of course. Yeah. And hopefully we get by. Maybe we have to tighten the belt because, we're just not sure what to do, but I think it's important to kind of understand all of the different pieces of this and how they are put together.
Yeah, I'm glad you said what you just said, because I think there's an important distinction here between good to great, right? When we think about someone who saved perhaps several $1,000,000, like if you have a few $1,000,000 saved, unless your expenses are outrageous on a month-to-month basis and you're eventually drawing from Social Security, like you're going to be okay, right? On some level. But what's the difference between okay and optimize, or the difference between good and great? That's where the nuances really come in terms of asset location, tax decisions, healthcare decisions, making sure we're evaluating the risks around the retirement paycheck. And what we're really talking about here, just to paint the picture before we go further, is the way you've described this before, Tim, which I love, is the concept of a retirement paycheck, right? So most of our listeners, outside of maybe the entrepreneurs that are out there, listening, they're used to receiving a paycheck from their employer, and that will happen for 30 to 40 years. Sure, different employers over time, but once a month, twice a month, we get a paycheck, and then we budget and we plan accordingly. Well, now what's in front of us as we transition into retirement is, we've got to move from that employer providing that paycheck to us producing that paycheck. And we've got several buckets that we're going to be pulling from. So you mentioned a few, right? Traditional accounts, Roth accounts, brokerage accounts, typically something like home equity, might be in the decision. We've got Social Security, we might have a pension, we might have an annuity, we might have real estate, we might have business equity. We have all these buckets, and we're trying to figure out between all these buckets, and let's say somebody's net worth is $3, $4, $5 million, where does that $3, $4, or $5 million live? And then based on where that lives, based on our expenses, based on Social Security decisions, based on healthcare decisions, all these different factors, we then need to figure out how to pay ourselves a monthly paycheck or whatever frequency, and then how that's going to adjust over time, and in what order we're drawing down from those buckets. And what I heard you say, and I want to spend a little bit more time on this, is that asset location, where your assets are located, doesn't just matter when you're in retirement, right? So while you're in your accumulation phase, of course, where your assets end up are because of where you put your assets during accumulation. And so are there planning opportunities? Are there adjustments that could be made during accumulation to optimize our situation from an asset location, tax location in retirement? So let me get out of the textbook for a minute, Tim, and just give my personal situation, right? So I worked for 2 state universities here in Ohio for over a decade, was contributing money to a 401a. So think of that as the 401k equivalent on the state university side of things. When I left that work, I rolled all that over into a traditional IRA. And if you look at my asset pie, if we put the business aside for a moment, if you look at the asset pie, right, it's very heavy on the traditional side. And we've got some Roth accounts, we've got some HSA accounts, we've got brokerage accounts, but very heavy on the traditional side. So here I am in my early 40s, and the nest egg calculation might look good, or the retirement calculator, how much is enough, looks good. But the question behind that is what potentially might be able to be done from an asset location to be able to balance out that traditional side a little bit further. So can you just add some color to that?
Yeah. So to your point, we'll just use round numbers. You might have $1 million in a rollover IRA, that's pre-tax. But if we assume a 25% tax bracket between what the federal government takes and the state of Ohio, whatever that is, like, you don't have $1 million, you have $750,000. The danger that you have, and we see this quite a bit, is when you get to be a certain age in retirement, the IRS says, hey, Tim, remember all those years that we allowed you to grow that money tax-free? Now you're age 72, and we are going to force you to distribute an amount of that from that account every year, right? So they'll look at the balance, they'll look at a table, and they'll say, okay, this year you have to distribute $100,000 of that. The problem with that forced distribution, these are called required minimum distributions, is that you have no control over the tax on that. So like if that pushes you into a 24% federal tax bracket, you're paying more tax than if we were to just do that over time and get that into the Roth bucket, right? Because the Roth, there are no RMDs. So that's the hidden tax bomb, is that they're forcing your hand to distribute that, which means you're climbing the tax ladder. And if with a little bit of planning, we could say, okay, instead of paying that at the 24%, maybe we can pay that at the 12% or even the 22% on our own terms. So that's part of the danger, right? And yeah, to kind of go back to your point, in the accumulation phase, the paycheck is what's doing the heavy lifting for you. You're climbing, you're earning, you're saving, you're investing, you're building your wealth. And in the accumulation phase, especially, early to mid in that phase, like, mistakes can be corrected with time, future earnings. I can always earn more, right? Continued contributions. And when that shifts to the withdrawal phase, the decumulation, the volatility, which could have been an employer or just your ability to work, kind of shifts to like the markets, and how much I can safely spend and draw down. So, but if you overlay like what the government is forcing you to do because of these it can just be very inefficient, with regard to how you're spending this down. And, obviously we're talking about some of the emotional side, the market volatility, sequence risk is at play.
Yeah.
So you don't really have a reset button that like, hey, I can always work longer. I can always do more. You're kind of, you're 68, you're 70 years old. Like maybe that's not a thing that you can do. I think that the purpose of these types of episodes is to shine a light further on down the road to get people to start thinking about this, because it just doesn't have, it's like, it's the retirement number. It's, hey, you're going to retire at 65. It's, and it's just, it's not necessarily you reach that number or you reach that age and everything is like easy. It's not.
Yeah. And on our previous episode, we were talking about expected net worth, and we'll link to that in the show notes if people didn't catch that. And you gave some general rules of thumb based on age of where someone's expected net worth, might be, not for specific planning purposes, but just to get a general feel of, hey, I'm a 50-year-old pharmacist. Like, what might that mean quantitatively on track from a net worth standpoint, right? That's the intent of those calculations. But as you articulated well in that episode, where those assets live is a really important secondary conversation. And for those that are nearing retirement, obviously that's going to then be focused on, sure, maybe there's some adjustments to be made, but in what order are we going to distribute and how are we going to optimize that? For those that are listening in their mid-career, to your point, in my situation, what could we be doing now from a planning standpoint to optimize for 20 years into the future? And if you go back to my example in the required minimum distributions, not only is there not a control on the tax standpoint, but there's not a control on whether you need those funds or not. They're getting distributed and they're getting taxed. So, let's say that for whatever situation, which would be a good problem to have, but it's still an inefficient one, that, what if I don't need that income in that year because of either other assets or, hopefully I'm still healthy enough to be able to work or do other things. Like either way, that money's getting pushed and you're getting taxed, right? And it can't stay invested and it can't stay compounding or accumulating. So
yeah. And if you can always reinvest it, you can always put it into a savings account, and buffer. So those are possibilities. It's just that, if we were to flip the script and say 100% of your dollars are in Roth accounts, which there's risk to that as well. But let's say 100% of, that $1 million, that you theoretically have is in Roth. The government's already taken their bite of the apple. So they're like, you don't have to distribute that. There's no RMDs. And that $1 million is actually your $1 million. Now, the risk of paying the tax up front and then allow it to grow tax-free is that, if you were to decide to move to Florida or Texas where there's no state income tax, you're paying state income tax in Ohio, on the front end. But then your tax bracket could be lower. And there is a chance, although I think it's a very marginal chance, that, you pay, let's say your effective rate is 20% this, today. It could be lower in the future. Now, I don't think that is with the way the government is spending and all that kind of stuff. But like that could happen is that, actually when you go to retire or withdraw that, maybe your effective rate is 15%. So you paid a 5% premium, tax-wise, where you could have spent. So there's uncertainty there. I kind of believe that taxes are going to go up in the future, and I'd rather just have control of the flow of money out of my investment account. Now, that's not to say like that it should be 100%. Now, there are some books out there that says like, pay 0%, tax, and it basically advocates to get everything in the Roth, but there's risk in that strategy as well. So, there's just a lot of moving pieces.
Yeah. And then some of the other wrinkles I'm thinking about is, often maybe I'm speaking for myself and projecting this onto others, but I think often people that are in the midst of their working careers think of retirement as this, I'm going from full-time to no time. And that might be the case. But I think for a lot of pharmacists, one of the unique aspects of our industry is that there is a lot of PRN or part-time work available. And so that significantly would have an impact on building your retirement paycheck if you're able to, pick up part-time or have the option to. So one of the things you've talked about before on the show, sequence of return risk, market goes down, we're forced to pull assets out of our portfolio. But if I have an option for part-time work to mitigate the negative impact of that, and we have that lever to pull if we need it, that's going to be important, right? When we're building the retirement paycheck. So just so many different details to be thinking about as we're saving and building our assets and accumulation, but also beginning to think about how we're going to build that paycheck in retirement. I do want to talk about Social Security and healthcare here for a moment, because I think there's a lot to consider, and we're not going to go in the weeds on either one, except to mention the importance of them in the retirement income, because they are so significant. And we did cover Social Security common mistakes before, episodes 294, 295 a few years back. So we'll link to those in the show notes. But Tim, for many people, if we think about just general statistics, Americans nationwide, Social Security really does become the foundation of the retirement paycheck, right?
Yeah, it does. Obviously, the higher you are income wise, and I would say most pharmacists are going to be in the top 10% at least of household income in the United States. The higher you climb that ladder, the lower the percentage is.
Yeah.
If you're making 40 or 50 grand, it could be 100% of what your paycheck is in retirement. But that doesn't necessarily mitigate, the decision from a Social Security perspective can be a 6 or 7 figure decision. So, I recently gave a webinar, and, I was kind of listing some of my observations with Social Security. I think, one of the things we hear is like, it's not going to be there. If I'm in my 40s, it's not going to be there in 20 years. I think it'll be there. It's definitely one of those things. Unfortunately,
we're going to be in real trouble as a country.
Yeah,
if there's not Social
for
Security.
sure. Yeah. So, it is one of those things where I think it's too big to fail, but it will change. And I think it'll change in terms of maybe a lesser benefit later, so you might, it might be where you can't claim Social Security at 62. Maybe the first time you can claim it is 64. Maybe they extend the credits on the back end. So like you can get delayed credits at 70, maybe they'll extend that back out to 72. So I think, and then I think also tax, the tax, how Social Security's tax will change too. I think more of the benefit will be taxed. I think the other thing too is that, I think that retirees and often underestimate how long they're going to live.
Yeah, longevity.
I think that they also sometimes can look at this in a silo. So if we look at you and Jess, you might say like, hey, my family doesn't live long, so I'm gonna claim it as early as possible. But that might not necessarily be the best thing. Like you have to look at this as a household, because when one spouse dies, the other one gets the higher of the remaining benefit, right? So spousal income implications are really, really important for this. And I think just people underestimate the permanence of the decision, meaning like, it's not like Medicare or some of the other things that you have to decide throughout retirement. This is kind of a one and done, and with very few exceptions. So once you start your, claim your benefit, it's really hard to unwind that. And it can lead to permanent loss in terms of the benefit that you receive. And, I also think that the people underestimate the importance of an inflation protected income stream. So there's no
Which
other
is Social Security.
Right. So every year the government says, hey, your benefit's going to go up 2.9%. A few years ago it was north of 8% because we had, wild inflation. Everything else, you're kind of losing your spending power. Obviously if you're invested, that's part of the beauty of investing is to keep ahead of tax and inflation. But, that is one of the most powerful things. So even though pharmacists, for the most part, it'll be, a third of the paycheck, 40% of the paycheck, or maybe somewhere in there, that's still significant. And if that's inflation protected, it just allows your traditional portfolio to grow, and be protected if a good part of like what you need is coming from the Social Security benefit.
Yeah, I think a lot of pieces here for folks to think about, right? The timing decision is the one that I think gets all the headlines for good reasons. But you talked about longevity, you talked about spousal considerations, thinking about this as a household, what portion this will make up of the broader retirement portfolio. So a lot of pieces to be thinking about. And I do think one of the things that makes this challenging is from a planning perspective of someone who even say our phase of life, early 40s, let me ask you, how are you thinking about Social Security? So we're still, you know, 30 years away, right, from a potential withdrawal if we take a delayed benefit, and you're trying to do retirement check projections and so forth. Is it you assume a zero because it's so far away and there's so many question marks, or you look at the current benefit and you say, I think there's going to be some changes as you talked about, and so to be conservative, I'm going to assume half or what it would be. What do you think?
I think honestly, the way that I think about Social Security, for me now is claim at 70. I don't really think of it in terms of percentages. I think of it in terms of um, just maximizing the benefit for lifetime income, which right now the system, you can claim as early as 62, and you take a significant haircut on your benefit because most people's full retirement age will be 65, 66, somewhere in that range. But if you delay to 70, then you get, every year you delay past your full retirement age, you get a 7 to 8% increase when you do
Yep.
claim. So for me, when I look at this, I think of it as, hey, even if I retire at 65, for those first 5 years of my retirement, I'm going to figure it out myself. So that could be where I am, maybe I'm working part-time, maybe I'm the old guy around, YFP, still collecting some type of
Shaking your
salary,
cane.
shaking
Yeah.
my cane, waving my fist at the clouds. It could be where, again, I'm just leaning on my traditional portfolio a little bit, knowing that when that age 70 rolls around, then I can take a little bit of a breather because I have that money coming in. And it could also be, using another tool that we've talked about a bit is an annuity. And maybe I buy an annuity for period certain, meaning from 65 to 60 to 70, here, insurance company, here's X amount of dollars. I need a paycheck for 5 years. It's a little bit of a dent into my portfolio, but not terrible. And then I think those are the way, how I'm framing it in my mind. It's less so about a percentage or the actual dollar benefit, and just knowing what I know about the system. In most cases, even if I were not to live very long, Shay will probably live very long. She's very healthy and active and things like that. And if my benefit is higher, which may or may not be the case, but if it is, then I would want her to have that, when I'm gone. So that's how I'm framing it in my mind, more so than, the dollar amount or the percentage of what we actually need.
Can't think of it off the top of my head. I want to say it's like 305, 306, something like that when we did the annuity episode. So we'll link to that one in the show note as well. Debunking some of the myths around annuities, where it may fit, where it may not, different types of annuities, thinking about the decision to buy, does it make sense, et cetera. So check that out in the show notes. Tim, I want to briefly talk about healthcare. You already said this earlier in the show. Common misunderstanding out there is that Medicare covers all healthcare expenses and that it covers nursing home and long-term care costs, which is not true. And therefore, if not true, we need to be thinking about the healthcare expense side of things as we're building our savings and accumulation, and then also how we're going to fund those in decumulation. And let me tee this up with one more thing. On last week's episode, you talked about a cognitive bias where, we can look back a period of time and recognize that, hey, I'm different from where I was 5 years ago. Could be my health, family situation, all different types of things. And so if we're in our 40s or 50s and hopefully we're relatively healthy, it can be difficult to paint a picture of our 70s or 80s where there might be significant healthcare expenses. It's just hard to visualize, right?
Yeah, it really is. And again, I think the best way to do it is to kind of put yourself in, if if your parents are 30 years older than you, like that's, envision yourself. I had an interesting conversation with my parents who are in their 70s. My dad turns 80 this year. where they're starting to like acknowledge that, when they retired to Florida, they were kind of the younger crew, and now they're not. And I think there is a little bit, as you proceed through the like retirement, I think there is a little bit more of reflection in a sense that like when you're working and you're raising a family and you're doing things, like it's hard for us to slow down and kind of like project out like that. And I think in retirement, I think you can start to see that a little bit more clear. Maybe not at first, but as you kind of proceed and you start to see maybe people pass away and those types of things. So I think the way that, I want to kind of open, a little bit of the healthcare discussion is, and this is one of the problems with the 4% rule. So if you're familiar with the 4% rule, the idea is that, if you have $1 million and you spend that down, 4% each year or 40 grand a year, the portfolio won't fail. Like you'll have money, and they overlay the worst rolling, I think 30-year period. And, they overlay that as like the worst rolling 30-year period. If you were to distribute 4.2%, you're good to go. The problem with that is that it assumes a lot of things. And one of the things it assumes is linear spending. And what we have discovered is that in retirement, we don't spend linearly. It's actually more of a smile. So when we retire, we kind of get into the withdrawal decumulation phase in what's called a go-go mentality of like, okay, school's out. I don't have to punch the clock anymore. Vacation, visit kids, grandkids, YOLO, right? And as one should, right? Like all the things that you might have not done because you had to, go to an office every day. Like now you don't, and you want to take advantage of that. And you're still able-bodied, right? So you want to be able to do those things. And then you kind of go into more. So spending is higher, right? You might be going out more, dining out, all that kind of stuff. Then you kind of move into more of a slow go, which I would kind of put my parents at now, where it's like, that trip to Europe, maybe not so much anymore. Maybe some of those purchases that you were doing previously in retirement, you're not doing that anymore. So your spending starts to slow, and that's kind of the trough of the smile. And then you kind of transition into more of the no-go stage of retirement, where you're not really doing a whole lot, but you see the increase in healthcare expenses in long-term care.
End of life eventually.
So that's the other side of the smile. So Fidelity does a study. I think they look at these numbers every year. And the most recent numbers that I found is that a 65-year-old individual retiring today is estimated to need about $172,500 in after-tax savings for healthcare expenses throughout retirement. A retired couple at age 65, roughly $345,000. So
Wow.
I think one of the hard parts about retirement, so we talk about this from a liquidity perspective and a savings plan, is having buckets for different purposes. If I have a $2 or $3 million portfolio, a lot of us don't say, unless it's in like an HSA, here's my $345,000, Shay, for healthcare expenses, right?
Yeah, you're not assuming that, no.
Right. So I think not drawing that line, I think can be a little bit, worrisome. So just to kind of put some nuance to these numbers, these estimates generally assume enrollment in traditional Medicare Parts A, B, and D. So inpatient, outpatient, and then a kind of a drug plan. They include premiums, co-pays, deductibles, and prescription drugs costs. They do not include long-term care expenses, which can absolutely nuke a retirement plan, because when I look at that, the numbers are all over the place in terms of what you need, but you could need another $500,000 or more just for that, right? And, you're staying in a nursing home, unless you are, on Medicaid, which means you are well below the poverty line, like that's all coming out of pocket. So what often happens is, if we don't have a long-term care insurance policy, which again, a lot of people are a little bit hesitant to that, you're self-insuring, which means it's coming out of your pocket, or, hey, son or daughter, can you hook mom and dad up and like take care of us? So these are all the things that I think need to be accounted for in a retirement plan, that often are not, right? So healthcare expenses, long-term care, we're living longer. So both of these, we probably can see these numbers increase. And then of course, if you overlay the whole, what is the highest expense in terms of inflation year over year? It's probably healthcare, right?
Oh my gosh! At least using our employer healthcare costs as a barometer, yes.
Hey Tim, guess what? Your health insurance plan is going to get worse and it's going to get more expensive. That's kind of the on
12%.
repeat. Yeah, on
Fear not,
repeat.
though. It's below the industry average of
Right.
13. It's like, my
Thanks.
goodness. Yeah. Yeah. No, I think it's a really valuable conversation. And I like the bucket concept of, are we thinking about our nest egg or a significant portion of our nest egg having to go to healthcare costs? And obviously underneath that is a lot of strategy, everything from potentially long-term care insurance, Medicare, decision making, even HSA accumulation is something that I'm thinking about as you're talking about. So not only things for the pre-retirees to think about, but also those that are in the accumulation phase. What might we be thinking about and doing as it relates to this? And we're bringing back all the goodies this episode, but we also did one on long-term care insurance, so we'll link to that one in the show notes along with the Social Security and the annuity episodes and
And
the
I'm
Medicare.
shameless plug, Tim. I am doing a webinar here shortly on long-term care insurance, Medicare.
Let's go.
So hope maybe we can link the invitation for that.
Yeah. So anytime we have upcoming webinars, you can just go to yfewealth.com/events. We'll link that in the show notes, but you'll find that webinar in there once it's ready to go live. I want to wrap up our discussion talking about the emotional shift from accumulation to decumulation, right? So what was once considered success all throughout accumulation, we're trying to not touch our investments. We're seeing the balances hopefully grow outside of, dips in the market and some of the volatility that's to be expected. But then that suddenly changes. And now if we're, doing our decumulation strategy, we may in fact see those balances go down, or even if they're going up, psychologically, we're pulling money. We're not contributing money anymore. As obvious as this sounds, Tim, I think this is something that emotionally has to be challenging. I know I'm going to struggle with it, but anyone who's in a saver type of a mindset, the strategy that got you there now looks a little bit different that we're trying to transition to. Talk through that a little bit more.
Yeah, and one of the things at play here is called the endowment effect. So like if I'm sitting on $30,000 of savings, and it took me a couple years to get there, and it sits there and it earns me interest. I value that a lot more than if like money is coming in and then going right back out. So like we even though a dollar is a dollar, we have this emotional attachment to that account. So you can imagine that over 20, 30, 40 years, that's what's at play here. So if you're in a saver's mentality for so long, it's really hard to then flip the switch and start spending that down. And then you overlay the emotion of like a volatile market, and then we're taking money out. It can be, a lot of retirees can really struggle with this, and losses feel more personal because like during the accumulation phase, a market decline is, you're not pulling money out, but a market decline is abstract. Like I make the comment to someone that's freaking out, they're in their 40s about the market going down 20%. And I'm like, you're not even going to remember this at age 60. Like, you're not even going to remember this 10 years from now. So it's actually like, hey, guess what? Like things are on sale right now. So think of it, frame it from that perspective. So it's abstracted in accumulation. It hits home in the withdrawal phase. So during retirement, people can mentally connect market losses with years of life, lifestyle, travel, maybe helping kids and grandkids and staying independent, right? So, and I think that there is a bit of like psychological scar tissue of decades of savings that, what's playing is the fear of running out, fear of running out of money, and an emotional discomfort of seeing portfolio balances decrease. So, I think, but I've actually seen this, and I remember talking to two pharmacists, and they had a problem just going out and spending, and like going out with each other, spending on a restaurant, spending on a babysitter, and I'm like, let's earmark those dollars for that. So part of this is coming up with a plan. It's like, hey, this money is for that. And knowing that, in the long term, we're going to be okay. Now, again, I think part of working with a financial planner is being able to say, okay, this happened. Let's run the numbers. The pharmacist brain likes that, and it can affirm what we are doing. Or if it doesn't affirm that, how can we adjust course and it not just be like, sticking our finger in there and be like, okay, I think I'm okay, and we're flying by the seat of our pants. So, there's a lot at play. There's the fear of the unknown. There's guilt with spending, as we've talked about. If you've been in a lifetime of just plowing money into these accounts for the purpose of retirement, but then you actually get there and it's like, all right, start to take money out, that can be very, very scary and uncomfortable. And I think that's we should acknowledge that, right? Because again, if we use the number $1 million and then the next day you're at $950,000 because you take out 50,000, like that emotionally, that's like, what do I do? Right. And that can be paralyzing, and it can really force people to live much, much below kind of what they can live, because of all of these emotions that are kind of coursing through themselves and trying to figure out what can I take and what's safe and what's not, and all the things, right?
Yeah, and I to your point, this is where the planning and some of the calculations can really help with the emotional side of it. I'm thinking of a couple I talked with several weeks ago where, we're talking about some of the retirement planning, and, he had shared that in conversation with an advisor inside of a big box custodian, the message was sort of like, "You're good, like it's all fine." And he's
I
like,
hear
even if
that
I know that,
I hear that all the time. It's like my advisor just
yeah,
tells me I'm good, I'm good, I'm good. And I'm like, what does that even mean?
yeah, and to be fair, for some people, like, they want nothing more than that. I think for a lot of pharmacists, even if the answer is the same, "I'm good," seeing the math and looking at the calculations and knowing that there's a plan, not if, but when something's gonna change, right, over,
Right.
30 years. We enter retirement with one plan. It doesn't mean that we're gonna stay there. Things will change and evolve, as we go throughout there. So, and really the take home point here is that we're accumulating for 30 or 40 years, right? And we're building up these accounts, and we're not building them up to just stare at them. And we have to build that spending muscle. I know, speaking for myself a little bit, it's taken me 10, 15, 20 years to get more comfortable spending, and really starting to shift that saver mindset. And for me, one of the big strategies that has helped, that you alluded to, is really earmarking those dollars. Even if it doesn't change, if I have five or $10,000 that is earmarked specifically for an experience or a trip, that feels different to spend those if I pull them from a general savings account,
Yeah.
or even if it's pulled from, an emergency fund or something that's overfunded. It just feels different because it's been planned for and accounted for. And I think that mindset can also apply, as we get into retirement.
And I would argue that, like, if you had 50 grand earmarked for this once in a lifetime trip or whatever it is, versus you just take out 10,000 willy nilly from I think the 10,000 actually hurts more, even though it's 40 grand more. Like I truly believe the psychology of bucketing and accounting for those dollars is that powerful. And I think having some type of that mentality in retirement to ease some of that stress around spending down a portfolio is needed.
Yeah, I agree, and that's why we're gonna call them Baker's buckets, or we do call them Baker's buckets, right? They've been branded,
Oh yeah.
because I think they matter that much, and it's a philosophy we apply with our clients in the planning process as well. Tim, great stuff. This has been a really fun conversation. I'm looking forward. We've got some exciting episodes coming down the pike, so I hope that you guys will stay with us and catch those episodes. We're gonna be talking about everything from some of the financial decisions that matter most in that mid-career 40s and 50s. We're also going to talk a little bit about if Tim and I were to start over, what would we do differently with money? What are some of the lessons that we've learned along the way? And then finally, a sneak peek that Tim and I are both going on a sabbatical coming up over the next several months. And we're going to talk about a sabbatical mindset and why developing a sabbatical mindset might be helpful even before you get to retirement. So, Tim, looking forward to those, and always appreciate the insights. This is a good one. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Scripted Wealth, Money and Meaning for Pharmacists. If you enjoyed the conversation, be sure to subscribe, leave us a rating and review, and share the show with a friend or colleague. It really helps more pharmacists discover the show and join us on the journey toward living a rich life today and tomorrow. And if today's episode got you thinking about your own financial plan, retirement goals, or what a rich life means for you, we'd love to help. You can learn more about our fee-only comprehensive financial planning services by visiting yfbwealth.com. And finally, an important reminder that the content in this podcast is provided to you for informational purposes only and is not intended to provide and should not be relied on for investment or any other advice. Information of the podcast and corresponding material should not be construed as a solicitation or offer to buy or sell any investment or related financial products. For more information, you can visit yfbwealth.com/disclaimer. Thanks so much for listening. Have a great rest of your week.